If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The first light of morning reached the Pacific Ridge without warmth. A thick layer of humidity covered every surface, clinging to uniforms, weapons, and skin. Private Daniel Rourke stood at the far edge of the encampment, half hidden beneath the dripping branches of a jungle tree. He kept still, watching the shifting colors of the sky through the dense canopy, trying to control the nervous weight building in his chest. He had slept less than an hour. Every time he closed his eyes, the same scene returned. Two men lying motionless after the ambush, the sharp echo of gunfire ripping through the tree-line, and the look on Sergeant Harlan's face when he realized Daniel's warning had been right. That look never left Daniel's mind. It was not anger, it was regret. And regret stung more than any punishment. Daniel had been respected once. He wasn't a loud soldier, nor a natural leader, but he had a steady mind and an ability to recognize small signs others overlooked. That skill placed him on reconnaissance duty. 3 weeks earlier, he spotted Japanese scouts setting up near the supply route and reported it, but the officers dismissed his assessment as misinterpretation. Hours later, the ambush happened. 2 dead, 1 permanently blinded, and Daniel labeled as the man who overreacted too late. Now he stood alone because no one wanted the weight of his silence near them. Behind him, the camp slowly came to life. Soldiers cleared their throats, checked rifles, lit small stoves, and muttered short conversations that always fell quiet when Daniel passed. The mission was simple: hold the ridge until reinforcements arrived. The ridge overlooked a valley the Japanese had been trying to capture for weeks. If the enemy took it, they would flank the American supply, chains stretching across the island. Daniel knew this. Every man there knew this. And still, Daniel was treated like a spare part, needed but unwanted. He forced his thoughts back to the present. If he let frustration take over, he would make mistakes. Mistakes in the jungle meant death. Daniel crouched, running his fingers lightly through the damp soil. Heavy rainfall during the night had softened the ground. Footsteps from the lower valley would be muddy, deeper, easier to hear. The jungle wasn't quiet this morning. Birds weren't calling. Insects sounded distant, as if something larger had moved through their territory. His heartbeat quickened. Something didn't feel right. A faint tension pressed against his spine like a cold hand. He scanned the tree-line below. Branches hung unnaturally low in some places. Leaves were torn, not naturally fallen. He noticed a patch of crushed vegetation, fresh, still wet, not yet sun-dried. Someone had passed through before dawn. Several someones. He swallowed, his throat tightening. They're here. They're already here. A sharp metallic click echoed faintly from the valley floor. The sound was small, but Daniel knew it well. Magazine seeding into a rifle. He turned toward the camp at once. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the enemy fired first. Machine gun bursts erupted from below, cutting the quiet morning apart. Dirt flew up around tents. Soldiers dove to the ground in panic, shouting orders that overlapped and collided. The ridge shook with the impact of sudden gunfire. Daniel sprinted toward the nearest group of stunned soldiers. His heart pounded hard enough to drown the sound of his own breaths. The chaos around him unfolded fast, too fast for most to process. Some men froze in place, staring into the jungle with wide, confused eyes. Others grabbed their rifles but looked unsure of where to aim. Daniel grabbed a corporal by the sleeve and shoved him behind a fallen log before the man even realized what was happening. "Move! They're coming up the slope now." No one asked how he knew. There was no time. Explosions hit the right side of the ridge, ripping open the communication tent. The signal operator barely rolled away before the second explosion collapsed the remaining poles. Smoke and dirt filled the air in thick bursts. The unit began to scatter. A sergeant shouted for everyone to fall back to the southern flank, but the Japanese fire pinned them down. Daniel scanned the chaos, spotting 7 soldiers clustered near the damaged radio line. They were younger, less experienced, and frozen by the suddenness of the attack. He rushed toward them, bullets snapping through the air. One shot tore bark from a tree inches from his head. He ducked, his pulse hammering against his ribs. "Get off the ridge," Daniel shouted, waving them toward the jungle. "Down the ravine now." They hesitated for half a second, recognizing him. Doubt flickered across their faces. But a mortar blast behind them shook the ground with such force that hesitation vanished. They followed. The group scrambled down a narrow slope, mud sliding beneath their boots. Vines slapped against their faces as they pushed through. Daniel stayed at the rear, covering the line, scanning for ambushers. When they reached the base of a shallow ravine, the gunfire above became distant but constant. Smoke curled through the treetops in thick gray ribbons. The 8 men crouched behind a cluster of rocks, catching their breath. The sudden quiet in the ravine felt heavy, like the air itself refused to move. One private asked, "Where's the rest of the regiment?" Daniel wiped rain and sweat from his forehead. His voice came out steady, even though his internal panic hadn't yet settled. "They won't reach us," he said. "We're cut off." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Some knew Daniel's reputation, some didn't, but all saw the seriousness in his expression. He wasn't guessing. He was certain. Daniel looked toward the valley, listening to the distant movement of boots and metal. 300 or more. Moving fast, climbing, hunting. Fear pressed against his ribs. Not the kind that froze him. This was the kind that sharpened everything around him. His mind began calculating distances, elevation, escape routes, ammunition. The jungle was thick, but not thick enough to hide them for long. He steadied his breathing. Whether they trusted him or not didn't matter. There were 8 of them now, including him, and the enemy was coming. He raised his eyes to the group, his voice calm despite the pounding of his heart. "We move," Daniel said. "We find high ground and hold it. It's our only chance." The 7 soldiers nodded reluctantly. Fear, confusion, and mistrust mixed in their expressions, but they followed. Daniel turned toward the trail leading deeper into the jungle. His mission had changed. It was no longer about the ridge or the regiment. It was about survival and giving these men a chance to live through the day. The rain grew heavier as the group pushed deeper into the jungle, soaking uniforms and blurring the edges of every movement. The ground softened beneath their boots, forcing them to slow down to keep from slipping. The air smelled of wet soil, gunpowder drifting faintly from the ridge behind them. No one spoke. Their breath came out in steady bursts, controlled and tense, each man trying to process the shock of the attack. Daniel stayed at the front, clearing branches quietly and checking the terrain with short, deliberate looks. He kept track of every sound around them. The jungle carried noise strangely, sometimes distant, sometimes near, and he needed to be sure nothing followed them. Every few seconds, he listened for signs of Japanese scouts spreading out from the main force. Behind him, the 7 soldiers walked in a staggered line. Their faces showed the same unease, uncertainty about where they were heading and whether they could trust the man leading them. One of them, a corporal with a fresh scrape across his cheek, finally asked what the others were thinking. "Where are we going?" Daniel pointed ahead. "There's elevation about a mile north. It overlooks 2 approach routes. We can control what comes at us." The corporal didn't argue, but his expression showed he wanted more. He wasn't sure why Daniel knew the terrain this well. The others seemed just as confused. Daniel understood their doubt. They barely knew his name, let alone his abilities. He kept his voice steady. "I've scouted this area before," he said. "There's a narrow ridge with natural cover. If we keep moving, we'll reach it before the enemy spreads out." It was the answer they needed. The question of why he was so sure, why he seemed to know more than the officers, passed quietly through their minds. They didn't push it further. Survival mattered more than explanations. A private stumbled on wet roots, and Daniel caught him by the arm before he fell. The young man's hands were shaking. He muttered an apology, embarrassed. Daniel gave a short nod and kept walking. The simple gesture steadied the group more than any speech. After another quarter mile, the jungle opened into a shallow ravine lined with tall ferns and large rocks. Daniel signaled them a halt. The men crouched behind the rocks while he scanned the treetops. The rain softened for a moment, allowing distant noises to carry. Metal struck metal, light but unmistakable. Boots splashed through shallow water. Someone shouted a brief order in Japanese. Daniel's stomach tightened. The enemy was moving faster than he expected. They were spreading across the valley floor, pushing upward in small units to cut off escape paths. One private whispered, "Are they coming this way?" Daniel kept his eyes on the direction of the noise, his pulse steady despite the rising tension. "If we stay here, they will." He motioned for them to follow him up a steep incline covered in thick vines. The path was narrow and forced them to move single file. The jungle canopy pressed close overhead, trapping humidity around them. Their breaths grew heavier, not from exhaustion alone, but from the weight of knowing they were alone on enemy-controlled ground. Halfway up the slope, they found a soldier from their regiment briefly clinging to life beneath a fallen tree trunk. His uniform was torn, and blood soaked into the mud around him. He looked at Daniel with confusion, trying to form words. Daniel knelt beside him. The man had a deep chest wound, too deep to treat in the field. Daniel's face tightened, not in shock, but in resignation. He had seen wounds like this before. They always ended the same way. He held the man's shoulder firmly. "You're not alone," Daniel said quietly. The soldier let out a slow breath, as if the tension inside him finally eased. He passed shortly after. The group remained silent while Daniel closed the man's eyes and checked his pockets for maps or intel. There was nothing except a torn set of orders indicating what the attack had been targeting. The ridge wasn't the enemy's final goal. They were sweeping the entire sector. The Japanese force wasn't merely passing through. They were preparing for a large-scale push toward the American supply route. Daniel folded the papers and placed them in his own pocket. The others watched him closely, waiting for direction. They wanted to ask questions, but feared the answers. "We keep going," Daniel said. "They're not stopping after the ridge." That was enough to make the group understand. Their situation wasn't a temporary setback. It was the beginning of something larger and far more dangerous. They continued climbing until the trees thinned and the ground leveled into a natural overlook. From there, Daniel could see portions of the valley through breaks in the foliage. Movement flickered between the trees, shadows, helmets, rifles glinting through the rain. Dozens, maybe more. The men around him gripped their weapons harder. Fear settled into their posture. Fear of the numbers, fear of isolation, fear of what they would have to face without backup. Daniel felt the same fear, but he controlled it. He forced his breathing into a slow, even rhythm. Panic would cloud his thinking. He needed to stay sharp. He knelt behind a wide tree root and observed the terrain. The ridge ran in a curve, forming a natural barrier that forced anyone climbing it into narrow angles. Thick vegetation, broken rocks, and tangled vines created natural choke points. With planning and discipline, a small group could control it for hours. He turned to the men behind him. Their clothes dripped from the rain. Their faces were pale but focused. "This place works," Daniel said. "We defend from here." One man asked, "Just the 8 of us?" Daniel checked the valley once more. Japanese soldiers continued moving through the lower trees in tight squads. Their numbers spread wider every minute. "Yes," he said, "just us." The answer settled heavily, but the group accepted it. There was nowhere else to go. Daniel began assigning positions, pointing to areas where visibility was clearest and where cover was strongest. He explained briefly how the terrain would funnel the enemy. His tone remained calm, straightforward. The men listened, not because of rank or authority, but because the logic was solid and his confidence was steady. A wounded private leaned against a tree, breathing through clenched teeth. Daniel tightened the bandage on the man's leg, checking the pulse and blood flow. The private winced, but managed a weak nod. His fear eased slightly from Daniel's presence alone. The rain began to ease, leaving a thick mist drifting between the trees. Distant footsteps echoed again, closer this time. Daniel rose slowly, gripping his rifle. "They'll be here soon," he said. "Get ready." The 7 soldiers settled into their positions, adjusting their grips and steadying their breathing. Daniel took the forward position, watching the jungle shift with movement below. He didn't feel like an outcast now. For the first time since the ambush weeks ago, he felt the sharp clarity of purpose settle over him. These men depended on him, whether they admitted it or not. He lowered his stance and waited for the first shapes to appear through the mist. The battle for the ridge was about to begin. Mist drifted across the ridge in slow waves, softening the outlines of trees and rocks while hiding movement in the valley below. The air smelled of wet bark and gun oil. Daniel steadied his breathing and scanned the slopes, waiting for clear confirmation of how close the approaching squads had come. The 7 men around him shifted into position, adjusting their footing, checking magazines, and wiping rain from their sights. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, but it helped them focus. A faint series of clicks broke the stillness, branches snapping under careful weight. Daniel raised a hand, signaling the others to stay low. Shapes appeared through the haze, spread out in disciplined lines. Japanese scouts moved with measured steps, rifles angled upward, eyes scanning for movement. They weren't charging blindly, they were testing the ridge. Daniel steadied his rifle, letting the weight settle into his shoulder. He didn't fire yet. He needed to understand how many were coming and where they were focusing their approach. 2 more squads emerged from deeper in the trees, forming a wide arc. The number was higher than he expected. His pulse tightened, but he forced himself to stay analytical. Panic wouldn't help. One of the younger privates whispered, barely audible, "How many do you see?" Daniel kept his voice low and steady. "Enough to start pushing us. Not enough to overwhelm us yet." It wasn't reassurance. It was a realistic assessment. The men appreciated that more than empty comfort. The scouts climbed closer, unaware of exactly where the danger lay. Daniel waited until they reached the narrow wash of exposed soil between 2 large rocks. The angle was tight, predictable, and difficult to maneuver around. That was the moment he chose. He fired first. The crack echoed sharply, shattering the suspended quiet. The first scout dropped instantly. The ridge came alive with gunfire from both sides. Bullets tore through wet leaves and chipped bark off trees. The 7 soldiers fired in staggered bursts, covering each other, adjusting their aim as more enemy troops pushed upward. The jungle filled with controlled chaos. The Japanese squads reacted quickly, taking cover behind roots and fallen trunks, returning fire with short, disciplined shots. Daniel moved between 2 firing positions, guiding a private's aim and signaling another to shift left to prevent flanking. He kept track of each man without thinking about it, his mind splitting the ridge into sections that needed reinforcement. A corporal beside him ran out of ammunition and fumbled with a new clip, hands shaking. Daniel grabbed the clip and loaded it for him with practiced speed, pushing the rifle back into the corporal's hands. The man swallowed hard, nodded, and returned to firing. Small gestures like that kept them together, simple, immediate acts that carried weight. The wounded private at the rear groaned and tightened his grip on a tree root as stray rounds struck the upper branches above him. 2 soldiers shielded him with their bodies, adjusting his position so he wouldn't be exposed. Daniel glanced back long enough to confirm he was still stable before focusing on the forward line again. A new wave of movement appeared below. More enemy soldiers pushing up, testing weak spots. Daniel recognized their pattern. Small units spreading out, try to find an unprotected angle. He shifted the group's formation subtly, pointing at rocks, logs, and patches of thicker growth where their fire would be most effective. Another volley of shots cracked through the ridge. Wood splinters burst from a stump inches from Daniel's arm. His pulse jumped, but he kept firing in controlled bursts. He centered his breathing, counting in short intervals, controlling the shaking in his hands. Fear stayed inside him, but it didn't control him. Minutes passed like this, fast, heavy, packed with movement. The enemy's attempt to push directly up the ridge slowed as casualties mounted. Several soldiers below shouted orders to reposition. Daniel noticed a shift. They were preparing for a wider attempt. He signaled the men to pull back slightly into stronger cover. They moved quickly, knowing the next wave would be larger. A heavy crack echoed from deeper in the jungle. Then another. Mortars. The first impact hit the lower slope, sending a burst of dirt high into the air. The shockwave rolled through the ridge, shaking loose leaves and soil. The men braced themselves as debris rained down. "Stay low," Daniel shouted, pulling one soldier away from an exposed edge. The second mortar landed closer, throwing mud across their positions. The ridge trembled under the force. The wounded private let out a sharp cry as the vibration jolted his leg. Daniel crouched beside him briefly, tightening the bandage again and checking his pulse. The man's face was pale but determined. "You're holding," Daniel said quietly. "Stay with us." The enemy fire paused for a moment, giving the group a chance to recover. They used the break to reposition, check magazines, and tighten their defensive line. Rain dripped from branches in steady taps, mixing with sweat and dirt on their faces. One soldier asked, "How long can we hold this?" Daniel looked over the ridge, assessing the terrain again. The slope still worked in their favor. The vegetation still slowed enemy movement. The choke points were still intact. "We hold until they change tactics," Daniel said. "Then we adapt." It wasn't bravado or empty confidence. It was a simple truth. They had no competing objectives. Survival required discipline, not hope. The next signs of movement came quickly, shadows shifting, faint murmurs of boots splashing through puddles, metallic clicks from rifles being readied. The enemy was reorganizing, preparing for a coordinated push. Daniel felt the pressure tighten around his chest. They were tired. Ammunition was limited. Every man felt the weight of the situation settling deeper into his bones. But the ridge was still theirs. The men around him looked more focused now, more connected. The doubt that followed Daniel earlier had softened. What mattered now was that he kept them alive. He stood behind a forward log, rifle steady, eyes trained on the mist-shrouded slope. The second assault was coming. He braced himself. "Positions," Daniel said quietly. The rain eased into a dull drizzle, the jungle dimming under the thick cloud cover. The enemy began to climb again. The ridge trembled under the weight of the renewed assault. The mist had thinned, revealing silhouettes moving with greater coordination than before. Japanese soldiers advanced in tightened formations, covering each other with precise bursts of fire. The scattered probing of earlier was gone. Now, they moved with the confidence of a force certain they had cornered a smaller enemy. Daniel pressed his shoulder against the rough bark of a tree and steadied his rifle. His eyes followed the shifting lines below, tracking how the squad spread out to cover blind spots. The men around him tightened their posture, feeling the pressure of what was coming. There was no calm before this wave, only a sharp, rising tension. The first shots came from the left flank. A private cried out and rolled behind a rock, narrowly avoiding a second burst that shattered the stone beside him. Daniel slid into position beside the man, firing a quick set of controlled shots that forced the attackers back behind a fallen trunk. "Keep your head down," Daniel said, pulling the private's shoulder back into cover. The man nodded, breathing hard but staying focused. More figures emerged through the dim light. Grenades arced upward, their faint metal clinks audible just before they struck the mud. Explosions shook the ridge, spraying dirt and leaves across their positions. The shockwaves rattled Daniel's ribs, but he pushed the dizziness down and moved along the line, checking where gaps were forming. The corporal with the scraped cheek had taken a forward spot behind a fractured boulder. He fired steadily, but was dangerously exposed. Daniel crawled through wet soil, grabbed the man by the collar, and pulled him to a safer angle. "You'll get cut down there," Daniel said, shifting the corporal's aim. "Use the lower edge. They're climbing for below." The corporal adjusted, nodded once, and fired again with clearer control. On the far right side of the ridge, two soldiers struggled to keep pressure on an advancing squad. Daniel signaled them to shift their fire slightly left to hit the choke point where the slope narrowed. They followed instantly, their rounds forcing the enemy to bottleneck in the tight gap between roots and rock. This was where the ridge worked in their favor. The terrain funneled attackers into small clusters, limiting how many could climb at once. Daniel used that advantage relentlessly. Rainwater trickled down his face, mixing with sweat and streaks of mud. His breathing came in sharp bursts now. He could feel fatigue pulling on his muscles, but there was no time to slow down. Not with the enemy pushing harder with every minute. A sudden scream cut through the gunfire. One of the privates on the rear slope slipped when a mortar landed close, the blast knocking him down the elevated edge. He slid halfway down the ridge, grabbing at vines and roots as soldiers below noticed him and opened fire. Daniel didn't hesitate. He leaped from his position and slid down the mud, reaching the private just as the man lost his grip. Daniel grabbed his arm, anchoring himself against a tree root. Bullets cracked into the soil around them. Daniel lifted the man with a sharp pull, pushing him back towards safer ground. "Move!" Daniel shouted, pushing him upward. The private scrambled up the slope, while another soldier reached down to drag him the rest of the way. Daniel remained exposed for a moment too long. A round grazed his sleeve, tearing cloth and burning the skin underneath. He dug his boots in, pushed off the slope, and climbed back into cover just as 3 rounds shattered the bark where his head had been. His heart hammered aggressively, but he shut out the fear and returned to scanning the ridge. The Japanese squads began coordinating fire from 2 angles, one pushing straight up, the other sweeping sideways to flank. Daniel recognized the shift and reacted immediately. He signaled 3 of his men to tighten the center line, while he and 2 others redirected fire to the creeping squad on the right. A grenade exploded behind a root cluster, shaking loose chunks of dirt. The wounded private at the rear groaned again, clutching his leg as the vibration jolted his injury. One soldier hurried to reposition him behind a thicker tree trunk. Daniel spared a glance. His condition was stable enough, but he wouldn't withstand many more shocks. They needed to end this wave quickly. Gunfire intensified. The enemy pressed their advantage, climbing in pairs, covering each other with rotating bursts. Daniel's group answered with disciplined volleys, each man focusing on survival rather than heroics. The ridge became a harsh exchange of flashes, broken branches, scattered dirt, and short commands. Daniel's internal pressure mounted. He felt the weight of each soldier around him, how they moved, how they reacted, how they depended on his decisions without admitting it. He didn't want that responsibility, but it was as whether he wanted it or not. He spotted a shift in the enemy line, several soldiers moving toward the narrowest section of the ridge, where the angle would force them to climb in single file. It was their weakest approach and also their most reckless. Daniel raised his rifle and shouted over the noise. "Right side, focus the gap." The 7 men redirected instantly, pouring fire into the choke point. The enemy advance stalled at once. Bodies slid down the slope, weapons clattering against roots and rocks. The pressure on the front eased as their formation broke apart. The Japanese soldiers pulled back several meters, regrouping in the lower brush. The gunfire didn't stop completely, but it grew scattered, less coordinated, less aggressive. Daniel let out a deep breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His arms trembled slightly from the recoil and adrenaline. He checked each man with a quick look, counting them. All 7 were still alive. Dirty, exhausted, shaken, but alive. He crawled back to the wounded private to inspect the bandage again. The man's breathing was tight, but stable. Daniel tightened the wrap once more and rested a hand on the soldier's shoulder. The private nodded weakly. The ridge quieted into a low murmur of distant movement. The enemy wasn't gone. They were regrouping again, but the push had failed. For the moment, the line held. The men leaned against trees and rocks, catching their breath. Rain dripped steadily from the leaves above, mixing with the fading smoke drifting through the branches. Daniel sat back on his heels and listened to the faint rustling below. The enemy was repositioning. They weren't done. He scanned their faces, fear, determination, fatigue, and something new, a subtle trust forming beneath the surface. They still didn't fully understand Daniel, but they followed him without hesitation now. Another distant shout rose from the jungle. The next wave wouldn't take long. Daniel wiped the mud from his rifle, reloaded, and steadied his breathing. The ridge wasn't safe yet. The day wasn't over, and the largest assault was still ahead. The ridge fell into a tense quiet, broken only by the low hum of distant movement and the steady drip of rainwater slipping from a canopy. Smoke from the last explosions drifted in thin lines across the air. Daniel wiped the mud from his sleeves, took a single breath to steady himself, and rose to check the right flank again. His body felt heavy, arms sore, legs trembling from strain, but his mind stayed sharp. The next moments would decide whether the 8 of them survived. Below the slope, scattered enemy squads moved between trees, preparing for another coordinated advance. Their formation had changed. They were spreading wider, adjusting angles, ready to surge as a unified force. Daniel studied their movement carefully. Fear pressed against him, but it didn't freeze him. It sharpened his judgment. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him again. If he chose wrong, every man beside him would die. He signaled the soldiers to reposition. They shifted silently, more confident in their movements now, trusting the terrain and trusting Daniel's instincts. The wounded private was placed deeper behind cover, shielded by 2 men who kept their rifles angled outward. Everyone knew he couldn't take another shock, and they protected him without needing instruction. The sound of boots splashing through wet soil grew louder. The enemy began climbing the ridge again, this time in a heavy formation. Dozens of soldiers pushing together, firing in short bursts to suppress movement. Daniel knelt behind a thick tree root, braced the barrel of his rifle, and fired into the advancing line. The men beside him followed, their bursts controlled and steady. Gunfire echoed across the ridge. Dirt sprayed upward as bullets struck the ground around them. A grenade landed near a large boulder and detonated, shaking the earth and throwing debris through the air. Daniel shielded his eyes, coughing through the sudden smoke, then immediately checked both flanks to ensure no one had been hit. The enemy pressed closer. 2 soldiers on the left called out, warning that several Japanese soldiers were flanking from behind a cluster of palms. Daniel shifted quickly, sliding through mud to join them. He fired 3 rounds, dropping the lead soldier and disrupting the push. The remaining attackers hesitated just long enough for the 2 Americans to drive them back with steady fire. The ridge trembled again under another mortar impact. This one struck the far side, sending a blast of dirt across the rear line. The wounded private groaned, but stayed conscious. Daniel crawled to him, checked his pulse, and retightened the bandage. Despite the chaos, the man's breathing remained stable. Daniel felt a small, grounded relief. A sudden burst of shouting rose from below, another assault wave forming. But something else followed, a faint rumble from the opposite direction, deeper in the jungle. Daniel froze, listening. The men around him paused as well. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, organized. Not enemy boots. American boots. Reinforcements. Daniel kept firing until the last possible moment, holding the ridge with the others until voices cut through the trees. Firm, disciplined commands carried by familiar accents. Marines emerged from the thick foliage, advancing in staggered formation, weapons raised. Their presence shifted the momentum instantly. The Japanese soldiers, realizing the ridge had been reinforced, pulled back in rapid retreat. Several squads broke off and disappeared into the valley brush. Gunfire faded slowly, then fully. The ridge finally fell into genuine silence. Daniel lowered his rifle. His breathing slowed. His shoulders, tense for hours, finally loosened. The men around him leaned against trees and rocks, exhausted beyond words but alive. Every one of them, even the wounded private, pale and trembling, managed a weak smile. Medics climbed the ridge seconds later, attending to the injured, bandaging cuts, checking pulses. Officers followed, speaking quickly with the Marines, then with the 7 soldiers who had fought beside Daniel. As they talked, pieces of the battle came together. How many enemy soldiers had advanced, how the ridge had nearly fallen, how 8 men had held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Daniel didn't step forward to explain anything. He didn't seek recognition. He simply sat on the damp ground, elbows resting on his knees, watching the smoke drift above the treetops. His mind replayed the battle in sharp fragments. Faces, gunfire, near misses, decisions made under pressure. He felt the weight lift slowly from his chest. One of the corporals approached him, breathing hard, uniform torn. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, waiting for Daniel to look up. When Daniel finally raised his eyes, the corporal said quietly, "You kept us alive." Another soldier joined him, then another. Soon all 7 stood near Daniel. Not by accident, not because they were ordered to assemble, but because they wanted to. Their silence carried a depth that words couldn't match. Respect, gratitude, recognition. A Marine lieutenant approached, crouched near Daniel, and asked for a clear account of what had happened. The others answered before Daniel could speak. They explained his decisions calmly and fully, how he guided them, protected them, and held the ridge when the odds were impossible. Daniel listened, surprised by how honest and unreserved they were. When the lieutenant walked away, Daniel remained quiet. He didn't need praise. The simple fact that these men stood beside him voluntarily was more meaningful than any commendation. The rain finally stopped. Light filtered softly through the canopy, illuminating the ridge that had nearly been lost. Daniel rose slowly, the soreness in his legs catching up with him. The 7 men formed around him as they prepared to follow the Marine column back toward friendly territory. For the first time in weeks, Daniel didn't walk alone. He stepped forward with the group, leaving the scarred ridge behind them, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not guilt, not isolation, but a steady sense of belonging. The day had taken everything out of them, yet they had survived. And with the ridge secured and the enemy pushed back, the sector was safe again. Daniel Rourke walked with the others, knowing he no longer carried his burden by himself. The outcast was gone. The soldier remained.